In this second part of Unit 1, Prolegomena to Translation, we will look at different ways to classify and describe translation phenomena or translation-related activities. Learning outcomes for this second part of Unit 1, students will be able to describe traditional and modern attempts at classifying translation phenomena, apply a proposal for a more complete classification to the analysis of examples, and identify and classify a list of typical translation-related activities according to type, modality, category, and method. Contents of this Part B of Unit 1 are first, review of traditional classifications by topic and by methodology. Point 2 would be a review of modern classifications by change of code, by translatability, by methodological difference, by text typology, by means and modes. And finally, a third point or section of this Unit 1 Part B, a more complete classification by Amparo Tadavir, in which we will look at classification categories, translation types, translation modalities, translation categories, and translation methods. By way of introduction, let's just look at the origins of or early attempts at classifying translation. They date back to the 4th century AD, and the protagonist is Saint Jerome, the patron saint of translators, and Latin church father, and famous translator of especially the Vulgate, or the Latin version of the scriptures of the Bible. In a famous letter called the Letter to Panmachio, written surrounding a controversy in which Saint Jerome found himself, he had translated a famous letter for private consumption, a letter by the Pope, in which the Pope was actually expounding on points of doctrine addressed to a certain bishop in answer to this bishop's questions on doctrine and so on and so forth. And this translation was requested by a friend, and dutifully Saint Jerome did translate the letter on the spot and asked him not to share it with anyone. This letter got leaked, and the enemies of Jerome were quick to note that the translation was too free and not really loyal to the meaning of such an authoritative document. So in this letter, Panmachio is talking to his friend, the politician Jerome is talking to Panmachio and defending his work and his views of translation. This letter has become one of the foundational documents of Western translation thought, and for our purposes here this translation is important because we find in it one of the main attempts at linking methodology and textual genre. That is, we translate certain texts in a certain way. In this letter, among other things, Jerome defends free translation when it comes to translating letters or other more pragmatic documents, but he ascribes to the translation of Holy Writ or the Holy Scriptures a more literal methodology. He recognizes that translation of the Scriptures requires a different approach, a more careful approach to form and to content, because, quote unquote, even the order of words is a mystery when it comes to the Holy Scriptures. So this type of texts, more authoritative and coming direct from God, would require from the translator a more careful adherence to form and content, unlike other documents such as the letter in question that he translated for this acquaintance. So this is a very early reference, even as oblique as it is, to an attempt to classify translation genres or different text types and different approaches or methods for translation. So it's a nice point of departure for this idea of classifying methods and classifying types of translation. At least in this letter we see an attempt at coming up with a certain criterion, in this case text type. So if we start with traditional classifications, we'll see that some of these earliest classifications of translation phenomena or translation-related activities can be or fall under two main categories. Classification by topic. Topic will be the main feature for classifying types of translation. We translate Holy Writ. So that would be Bible translation or sacred scripture translation, opposed to the translation of secular documents. So the subject matter, the topic, would be a criterion in this case for classification of different types of translation, traditionally speaking. The second would be a classification from the point of view of methodology. The method followed or adopted by the translator of the material would be the key criterion in this case to distinguish between different types of translation phenomena or translation activities. And here we need to note the super memes, that super meme of translation that discussed in the in our discussion of in a mini lecture on translation memes by Andrew Chesterman, the ever-present opposing dichotomic poles of methodology, literal versus free translation. In modern classifications, we find more sophisticated attempts at transcending or going beyond, moving further, as opposed to those traditional topic or method-related classification methods that we've just seen. So in the 20th century, this new classification of translation happened due to two main factors. The first one being the systematization or coming of age of transitional theory. Translation as an activity is an ancient human activity, obviously, as old as language difference and as old as language and written language or written systems of communication go. But the systematic study of translation is really relatively recent. We need to go back to maybe the 50s, and a separate academic branch dealing with transition phenomena called transition studies is quite a young academic discipline as such, dating maybe from the 90s. So this systematization of coming of age and transition theory and the study of translation is one of the main factors calling for new classifications. The second one would be the development of new needs in terms of the content and formats. Multimedia content will require new techniques, new varieties of translation, and we see examples of these new media and the new methodologies and the new ways of looking at translation that they will bring with them. Examples will be software localization, dubbing or subtitling of content, or multimedia content, or conference interpreting after the Nuremberg trials, especially in the simultaneous, as the simultaneous variety goes. So new technologies applied to add one to A and B. These new technologies that come with new developments in translation, in the transition of new media, will also be an important factor to add, not to forget, when it comes to classification, the classification of transition phenomena. Mainly machine translation, or translation 100% carried out by machines or computers, and computer-assisted translation tools, such as translation memory tools, which assist translators in or human translation. Amparo Hurtado Albir, in her 2001 Introduction to Translation History, Translation Theory and Translation Studies, identify a set of criteria for these modern classifications of translation: the change of code, translatability, methodological difference, conventional areas, text typology, and means and modes. To this, she added conventional areas. So if we look at the first one, the change of code, this criterion will take us to the idea of the code being a key point of reference as to classify, in order to classify translation phenomena. it refers to the code that is being used in the process of translation. If you remember the first part of Unit 1, we discussed in the last part of the video lecture, we discussed several definitions of translation being informed by different approaches to translation: the textual, the communicative, the linguistic. One of such linguistic approaches was that of Roman Jakobson in 1959, and we've already seen his 3 translation types suggested in his seminal article, influential article on the linguistic aspects of translation: interlingual translation, intralingual translation, and intersemiotic translation. And this is a great example. Jacobson's proposal of 3 translation types is a great example of the code being used as an important criterion, in the sense that we have verbal signs, inter and intralinguistic translation, and then intersemiotic translation, different codes being used: iconographic to linguistic, signs to linguistic, or linguistic signs to iconographic, or to gestures, or to different kinds of codes. One implied assumption here is that there's always a translation invariable, a kernel, a core of meaning which remains invariable even though we're changing from one code to the next. The second factor is translatability. The degree of possibility of translatability of a text will be a way of classifying translations, an additional way of classifying translations. Is translation possible? Is perfect matching or perfect equivalence possible? We've discussed a little bit of that in our discussion of the translation memes proposed by Andrew Chesterman. So opinions vary. Roman Jakobson was one of those influential scholars also in this regard, because in his 1959 paper he advocates for translatability. Everything can be translated except, according to Jakobson, poetry. Poetry being a form of literary expression in which both form and sound and meaning are closely intertwined. Therefore, since languages differ in form and sound, it is impossible, according to Roman Jakobson, it would be impossible to translate poetry. Although that's a very interesting, perhaps over-exaggeration. But he establishes a contrast between poetry and prose, or the translation of typical pragmatic everyday texts. Every meaning or every message can be reformulated in any language, or, in other words, any language can provide enough resources to express any message or any meaning. So it's just a matter of tweaking the verbal resources that we use in a language to express a similar meaning to that in a different language. So therefore, translation would be possible, according to Roman Jakobson. Also in translatability, there's we also find this idea of necessary sacrifice. Mona Baker is being quoted here as saying that in translation we have to adopt the principle of necessary sacrifice. There's always loss in some instance or other when attempting translation, both from the point of view of form or the point of view of meaning. The idea that there's always some kind of loss in one degree or another. So when language is in itself part of the content of a source text, like in the sentence that we mentioned in the example of untranslatability taken from Anthony Pym, the first word of this very sentence has 3 letters, T, H, E. We see that there are constraints from the point of view of form, and that there must be oftentimes that loss is a formal type of loss. So that's also an interesting concept to remember, that of necessary loss in translation. There's always something lost in the way, and oftentimes this is formal, and there's a loss in form due to language difference. Another point of reference for classifications, more modern classifications identified by Hurtado is methodological difference. We've already seen the pioneering early effort or early reference by Jerome in the 4th century in his letter Apammachium. Different text types require different types of methodology or different approach to translation of those texts. So this is also becomes an interesting criterion for classifying translation phenomena. Two examples could be covert and overt translation and semantic and communicative translation. The first covert and overt translation terminology would be by German scholar Juliane Haus, and the second, semantic and communicative translation, is taken from Peter Newmark, another influential translation scholar from Great Britain. If we look at the differences, Juliane Haus in 1977 identified two translation methods, covert and overt translation, and she linked this covert and overt translation to two main types of texts. As you can see, we have the pioneering work of Saint Jerome centuries earlier still underlies Juliane Haus's proposal, linking translation methods to types of texts or text type. Additional texts, for example, those texts which are unrelated or neutral as regards the source culture, covert translation will fully preserve the function and the source text and to conceal there being translations. So there are texts which do not have in themselves or are not linked to the source culture in a way that would be conducive for a translation of such texts, so that these texts will be perceived by the new readers as originals. See, that's what is meant in this case by covert translations. On the contrary, overt translations of what Juliane Haus identifies as interpersonal texts, those which are clearly related to the source culture by references, allusions, and so on and so forth, these require a second functional level of translation. They will not work as original texts as such in the target culture. They will not be perceived as original, but the fact that their translations will be overt, will be clear and obvious for the target readers of those translations, because the original was deeply connected, deeply anchored in the source culture, and therefore it is easy to see that these are translations because the readers do not recognize or do actually recognize, they don't recognize their own cultures, but they do see alien components of features in those texts. Examples of covert translation will be translation of journalistic, advertising, or technical texts. An adaptation of an advert would be perceived in the target culture as an original advert. It wouldn't be necessarily seen as a translation. It would work as an original, you see. The same goes for a technical text, a technical manual. There's no need to recognize, or there wouldn't be clear cultural signs or markers that would make the readers of a translation of the translation of a technical text to actually recognize that it is necessarily a translation. Examples, on the other hand, of overt translations, those translations which are obvious translations for the target readers, would be sermons, political speeches with cultural references, and other artistic texts like novels and so on and so forth. So these works are more deeply embedded in the source cultures. They are full of allusions, references, and cultural items that render a text, a translation of those texts, as an overt translation, because the readers of the translation would recognize that they are in fact reading a translation. So these are examples of methodological differences. Then, to continue with the second, communicative versus semantic translation examples, Peter Newmark identified three types of texts: informative, expressive, and operational. These three are familiar to us. And he linked these three types of texts and their functions or their aims to different methods for each. As you can see, the ideas are similar, but what changes is the terminology used, and we find this in transition theory to be quite a typical occurrence. The same concepts, the same notions being referred to with different terminology or taxonomies by different scholars, which adds to the confusion a little bit. We just need to make sure that we don't lose sight of the basic concepts. So for Peter Newmark, communicative translation would be used mainly for expressive texts, and semantic translation would be the best or most suitable translation methodology for informative and operational texts. For Peter Newmark, semantic translations, the goal for these semantic translations is to preserve also both the content and the form of the original. But as far as communicative translations go, and I quote, the translator attempts to produce the same effect on the target language readers as was produced by the original on the source language readers. So semantic translations are close to or attempt to be close to content and form. But the communicative translation methodology, or in this methodology, a translator tries to produce the same effect. He will have to depart from the form of the original, but the goal in communicative translation is to actually communicate an equivalent effect, to try to elicit an effect similar in the target language for the target text as in the readers of the target text as those who read the original in the original language and experience when reading the source text. So in this second methodology, or this latter methodology, translators have more freedom to eliminate differences, correct errors, and smooth the source text. So this would be, roughly speaking, semantic translation would be more literal, and communicative translation would be more or freer in this case. Talking about means and modes, another a Spanish translation scholar called Rabadán in 1991 proposed or suggested a classification in a table that will be shown in the next slide. In that classification, he identifies three means or media: sound, writing, and images. Those result from two key modes, primary and complex modes. As we can see, the suggested classifications tend to become more complex as we approach the present time. So we have primary modes will be oral texts of immediate reception, written texts, and iconic or picture-based texts. Those are primary modes: oral, written, and iconic. Oral texts are processed through interpreting. So we are dealing with speech and conversation or dialogue. Written texts are material for translation proper or written translation, and when it comes to pictures or iconic texts, these do not require translation because pictures are universal systems. So complex modes for Rabadán are mediated oral texts. Their reception is not immediate. They are not spontaneous in their production or reception. For example, written conference remarks, sermons, speeches, plays, etc. These are mediated oral texts. The reception is not immediate. They are not spontaneous in production. Text for immediate visual reception, advertising, etc. These are immediately or visually received. And finally, dubbing and subtitling text in cinema. Dubbing implies, as we will see later on, the substitution of the original soundtrack in a given language by a new soundtrack in a new language, or in a language B or a target language. So we can see Rabadán's 1991 model: means, mode, primary, complex. Then we have sound, writing, and image. From the point of view of sound and primary mode, we have intermediate and oral texts. Writing, we will have obviously written texts and iconic text in image, and this will be the primary mode. And then in complex mode, we have mediated, non-spontaneous receive oral texts when it comes to sound and writing. And then we also have mediated audiovisual texts in image and cinematographic texts like dubbing and subtitling. The last section will deal with an attempt at a more complete classification, and this classification comes from Ultaro Albir in her 2001 book. These categories are suggested by Amparo Ultaro Albir with the aim of producing a more complete classification of transition phenomena. She proposes a list of categories which are interrelated: socio-professional setting, source text and target text mode, nature of the transition process as regards the individual practicing the process or executing the process, transition method used. These are the 4 categories. From each of these categories, socio-professional setting, source text and target text mode, nature on the transition process as regards the individual and transition method used, Amparo Talbot derives transition, or what she calls transition varieties: type, modality, category, and method. All these categories are interrelated as well. So if we look at categories and varieties, we see that from the social professional setting we have transition types. Transition mode is, from the point of view of categories, is linked to transition modalities under the variety column. Nature of the process and the individual is linked to transition categories and the transition varieties. And finally, the method use has to do with transition methods. So transition types. She distinguishes 2 main areas. On the one hand, field-determined and non-field determined. Field-determined areas from the point of view of type will be transition of text in specialized genres and fields like technical, scientific, economic, legal, religious, etc. Those are field-determined areas. Non-field determined areas will be transitions of text which are not considered specialized. And this is a controversial topic because we need to define what a specialized text is and what a general text is, obviously. But in this case, non-field determined areas for Albert would include transitions of literary texts, advertising, and journalistic texts. Transition modalities, under those modalities, Albert recognizes or includes the following: written translation, written translations of written texts; sight translation, which involves the oral translation of a written text; simultaneous interpreting, which includes this spontaneous or simultaneous oral translation of an oral text as the oral text is being produced; consecutive interpreting. This would be the non-spontaneous oral translation of a speech after that oral text has been produced, with note-taking or without note-taking as the text is being uttered. So if we compare simultaneous interpreting and consecutive interpreting, the interpreter would be listening to the speech as it is being given or produced, and she would produce, or she will provide an interpretation with maybe 1-2 seconds of lag between the original and the target, but it will be simultaneous and generally through means of transmission from a booth or from a vantage point in a room. Whereas the consecutive interpreting, the interpreter will listen to a few minutes of speech or a fragment of the speech of varying length, and depending on the length, he or she would rely on memory or would rely on memory plus note-taking, and then from memory or from those notes and both would put together a translation or an interpretation of that particular version or fragment of discourse as it was uttered. Then another chunk of source material would be delivered. The interpreter would be taking notes or only relying on her memory, and then consecutively we will have original and interpretation. hence the consecutive modality. Then we have liaison interpreting, which is bidirectional or dialogic. There are two individuals speaking back and forth, and the interpreter will also go back and forth between both working languages as she interprets the conversation live. Then we have chuchotage or whispered interpreting. This is a kind of simultaneous interpreting which takes place in a low voice directly by the receiver of the message. You've probably seen examples of this in meetings in the White House or in dignitaries or representatives of or diplomats, where you have an interpreter leaning behind each one of them and whispering the interpretation of whatever the other person is saying at the time simultaneously, but without any technical means, just by whispering to someone's ear or behind that person. To continue with the list of translation modalities, we have dubbing. You've probably seen movies in translating or dubbed fashion. In this case, this type of audiovisual translation involves the complete replacement of the soundtrack or the dialogue of in a film with dialogue recorded by actors in a target language. The voice-over or voz en off is also audiovisual translation, but it differs from dubbing in that one can still hear or overhear in a much lower volume the source soundtrack. So as opposed to dubbing, the translation, the recording in the target language is superimposed, but you can still hear very faintly or very low. You can still hear the original soundtrack of the documentary or film. Subtitling is also under the umbrella of can also be placed or typically placed under the umbrella of the audiovisual translation. But in this case, as you are probably are familiar with subtitling, it involves the writing of text segments which appear superimposed in the lower or upper side of the screen as we hear the original soundtrack and the original dialogue in language one. We are reading a summary or an approximate translation of dialogues and narration in language 2 on the screen. L10N or localization involves, we have different definitions for localization, but the most recognized or commonplace definition of localization is the translation and adaptation of software and website content or applications and so on, or written material in devices into different languages and cultures. Some translations, songs are obviously being translated to be sung in a target language. It's a form of poetry translation, but involving music. Musical supratitling / captioning. If you've gone to see an opera, occasionally operas in languages other than English, you may see small LED screens where you can see a translation of the original libretto into the target language. Iconographic translation, translation of subordinated or iconographic texts, and that will take us to translation categories. By categories, or the categories that Baruta classifies or suggests in her classification model, we find first natural translation, which involves the innate and basic ability to translate that bilinguals or polyglots have. Trained professionals would be involved in this category of professional translation. Translation for the sake of translation. Translation is an end in itself, but mainly is triggered by a translation commission from a customer in exchange for payment. Translation for training. As you can see, we have the individuals, the stakeholders participating here define the translation category for Amparo Tadalbir. Translation for training, as opposed to professional translation or natural translation, involves the use of translation as a learning tool to train individuals or for the acquisition, or to help them, assist them in the acquisition of translation competence. Pedagogical translation. This is a traditional, perhaps old-fashioned, but still currently used method to teach or learn languages. Translation is used as just a means to an end, and in this case, the end is not translation in itself, but the development of language proficiency. Also, in translation categories, includes internalized translation. This is the use of comparison by language learners who constantly compare the second language structures and lexical units to the native tongue in the process of learning foreign languages. We know that we are making progress when we move beyond this internalized translation phase and we stop comparing or translating in our minds, as you probably have experienced as advanced learners of languages. Explanatory translation. Albir describes explanatory translation as a sporadic use of translation to gain access to unknown decontextualized meanings in a language being learned. She also includes direct translation, which is a translation from a second language into the native tongue of the translator. And then back the counterpart, back translation, when one translates from your native language into a second or foreign language, you are engaging in back translation. So translation methods for Amparo Hurtado Albir are four main methods. She suggests that applying these methods to the translation process will be a function of the purposes or aims of the translation process. So for methods chosen would have to match the purposes or the aims of the translation process. In this, she acknowledges functional approaches to translation. She recognizes, or she acknowledges, four main translation methods. The first one would be interpretative communicative translation of meaning. We are mainly trying to focus on the meaning and communication on communicating the information found in the source text, and translation will probably match the function of the source text. Literal translation, in this case, or linguistic transcoding, involves a very close rendition of the source text following the form, the syntax, the word order, and even the word structure. So this would be literal translation in the extreme, in which we will clearly read a target text and recognize that that derives from a source text or a source language due to the differences and alien structures that we will find in this translation. Free translation for Amparo Hurtado Albir will be the third method. This includes the transformation of semantic and semiotic categories. It's almost an adaptation. Examples of this would be a new version of The Lord of the Rings or Don Quixote for children, with heavy editing and changes in the material and the language and the style of the original works. Finally, the philological or scholarly or annotated translations, often used in university or college courses to provide access for students of canonical or classic works of literature in different languages, and for academic or learning purposes, full of notes, translators' notes, and editorial intervention to make the text approachable and accessible. In this final summary table, we see this translation classification by Amparo Hurtado Albir. Note on the left column we have translation methods, by which the main criterion in this case will be the method used, and in this and the translation method we see communicative translation, literal translation, free translation. We are classifying translation depending on the method. Translation category, according to the nature of translation process, the translation process and the individual that carries out the translation. We have natural translation, translation done by bilinguals without training, professional translation, translation done in the industry by professionals that are getting paid for it, translation for training, with trainee translators, pedagogical translation, internalized translation, explanatory translation, direct and back translation. As you can see, the important category, in transition category, the importance here, or the focus is on who is doing translation and for what purposes. Translation types, according to the socio-professional setting, we have technical translation, legal translation, economic translation, different types of different subcategories of translation. And finally, translation modalities, according to the translation. The main criterion here would be the translation mode. Written translation for written text, side translation from written to oral translation, simultaneous interpreting, the interpreter interprets at the same time as the source text or speech is being produced, or delivered, consecutive interpreting, there is an alternating of source material and translation with the aid of notes or just memory by the interpreter. Liaison interpreting, this is dialogic, we have two individuals or more than one or more than two participating in a conversation or a negotiation or an exchange, and the interpreter goes back and forth translating different parts of the dialogue from both languages. Then we also have susurrage or whispered interpreting, which is a form of simultaneous interpreting, and an individual is just whispering the translation to somebody's ear while the conversation is taking place, but in this case only interpreting to an individual. There is no dialogic as such. We also have dubbing and voiceover and subtitling, which are, as we have mentioned, subcategories of multi or audiovisual translation with different features, localization, etc. So in here we see an attempt, perhaps unwieldy or maybe too sophisticated or too complex, of attempting to classify translation phenomena or translation-related activities, which contrasts with that pioneering model or pioneering attempt by Saint Jerome in his letter to Pamacchio in the 5th century AD of classifying translation, mixing or linking rather text type or textual genre, types of texts with different methods. And as we can see, the sophistication of translation phenomena related or linked to new media, new technologies, and new forms of translation has called for more sophisticated ways of classifying translation, such as Amparo Tagalber's 2001 model that I present or describe here as an example. Some references for further reading, and thank you for your attention in this mini lecture, or this part 2 lecture for Unit 1.